Hi, welcome to week 4. We're already near the end of the program, which is so sad. Today we had our lecture from Martin Abelman on trafficking and prostitution, as well as our discussion on it afterwards. So in this video, I'm going to talk very briefly about the tone of the conversation, very briefly on the sex robots, and a little bit more on the Swedish system of prostitution and sex work. So I was very confused today, sort of, when we watched that video from Mariska, because it had a much different tone than what we got at the PIC. And I mean, I attribute that to the fact that our wonderful host at the PIC wanted us to have a good representation of what the red light district is. I'm sure they get many people with heavy stigma and negative thoughts from the get-go, and so she has to do her best to represent the women in the red light district. But watching that video, you definitely got a harsher reality that yes, there are victims of trafficking and exploitation in the red light district. So that just sort of shook me, because I did really want to believe that no one was being harmed or exploited in sex work here. So about sex robots, I would like to know when and who made that video, because I feel like people have been saying this for like a really long time and it hasn't happened. I hope it never happens. My biggest legitimate reason for being against the sex robots is they would absolve the need for consent, because why would a robot need to consent? And then who knows what harm people that are used to having sex with robots would then bring to real relationships where they may not ask people for consent either. On a similar note, by designing robots that look exactly like real women, there's just a huge objectification undertone to that. I'm having trouble thinking of the exact words to describe what I mean, but women are already objectified. We are already seen and described without having intelligence or a brain, or if we are, it's not important. Our looks are more important, as our president so nicely demonstrates. So when you then have a robot who does not have other qualities besides looks and sex, you are further you are objectifying a robot because it's a robot, but you're making it easier to objectify women, I would say. One last note on the robot was that there was I don't recall seeing a single robot of color, and they all had inhumane big eyes, and the beauty standards were just terrible. And lastly, I want to just mention, I want to try to articulate a little better than I did in class, that I do feel like the Swedish system is benevolently sexist, and I think I said benevolently feminist in class, and I meant benevolent sexism. The fact that it is the clients who are the bad people, they are the bad guys, literally, and not the women themselves. So I just wanted to clarify that and mention that it's also punishing people who want sex. And I think that's harmful to youth to grow up in a system where people who want sex are criminalized, because we already have such a lack of sex positivity, but to really criminalize it, I think, could create really terrible stigma. That's all. See you tomorrow. Hi, today is Wednesday. We had our long discussion on everything from LGBTQIA to homonormativity to are you born this way or is it a choice? So I want to talk a little bit more about separation, segregation, integration, assimilation, and homonormativity paralleling feminist normativity. I'll explain that. So I first want to sort of just compare and contrast separation versus integration, I think. So I totally see both sides of the argument of if to establish context. If the world was granting rights to everyone and there was no stigma, would the queer community still want to have queer spaces, or would they want to just be mixed in, and would straight people want to be mixed in and all of that? And I actually thought of that question when thinking of race. I sort of thought this when I was learning history, that that Black people, once they got their rights, would want to, or would just merge into the white world, and obviously the white people set up barriers that didn't allow them to do that. But even now, still, and again, there are lots of white controlling reasons you see that Black people still want to have their own spaces. And so looking in the queer aspect, I'm sort of just going to compare and contrast the two ideas, or I guess positives and negatives of both. So so fully assimilating or integrating, I'm not sure which one, would entail sort of letting go of the oppressive history and accepting that everyone is equal, and it would stop it from being a them versus an us situation. It would stop queer people from being a minority. On the other hand, one, it's important to honor and remember your history. Two, it allows you to talk about issues specific to you with people like you. On the other hand, it can exclude people from those conversations as well, because right now it's like we have this feminist world where feminists argue and then everyone else, and we just sort of throw tweets at them, or at least that's how it's portrayed, but we're not going to get through to them unless we're talking with them. And of course that involves them coming over on our side, but it can't just be yelling at each other anymore. Anyway, we know that. But on the other hand, even if we all stayed equal and there was still even if queer rights were 100% granted, separating would just allow room for more for more stereotypes and homonormativity and heteronormativity. On the one side of the separation, you just have straight people and heterosexuals becoming more straight and making stereotypes about the most prominent people in the other group, the queer group, and the queer people doing the same for them. And it doesn't seem very helpful, I guess. Obviously I get both sides. What I was going to say about feminist normativity is that, can I do this and still be a feminist? Am I a feminist if I get married? Am I a feminist if I believe in capitalism? And a lot of strong feminists might say no. A lot might say, of course, anyone, which is it's a common dialogue that we see right now. But I think it's important that we just, whether or not you say yes or no, we educate people on both sides without yelling at them. And I think that includes opening up feminist spaces a little more. I feel like even in our class, everyone knows what the right answer is, and saying the wrong answer gets you attacked. And I and so you'll just shut up and you won't, maybe you'll listen, but because you can't say your own idea, you're always sort of gonna not want to hear the other reason. It's just hard to have that conversation, so you end up having the conversation with people who might not be feminists, and that makes it harder. Okay, see you tomorrow. Hi, today we had our lecture with Bear on BDSM. I want to talk a little bit more about separatism, feminism in the queer community, and briefly mention physical disabilities. So I believe in my last vlog I spoke about how I'm not sure if I see separatism as a good or bad thing, and I weighed the pros and cons. And I think what's really bothering me about it is I'm having trouble seeing the difference between anger and hate. So for example, today Bear discussed their different scenes, good pun, the different like BDSM spaces, communities for hetero and queer people. And when they talked about the hetero spaces, they were really adamant about not liking that space, which makes sense. I totally 100% understand that, and I think that anger is great, and that's what leads you to find your own supportive community. I'm so nervous that all these different communities, that anger, especially when it's, manifested by, or it's culminating, because everyone is angry, that's going to turn into hate. And that's how you get one, a community with a bad reputation that doesn't have, that can't gather mainstream support, and two, isn't good. I don't think you can be a feminist or a social activist if you just hate people. You could hate, well, I don't know. I guess I was gonna say that you can hate the homophobes and the transphobes, but don't hate every heterosexual person. But I guess specifically in this example that the hetero space was homophobic and transphobic. So I guess I'm still working that out in my head. Speaking of feminists, Bear kept pointing out how Lainey kept looking surprised every time someone in the BDSM communities weren't perfect. And I think we sometimes forget that just because you're queer doesn't mean you're a feminist. Every queer person is a person too. Everyone has sort of ingrained prejudices that you have to work to overcome, but they're in the back of the mind sometimes, oftentimes. But especially in a women's studies field, I feel like we expect every gay and asexual and trans person to be a liberal Democrat that's political and feminist, and that's just not true. I mean, you can take Caitlyn Jenner as a very public example. And I think that's my final thought on that subject. And lastly, I briefly mentioned today, I asked about the presence of physical disabilities in the BDSM community, and I did that because people with physical disabilities are so often assumed to be asexual and non-sexual, which is total bullshit. And so I was thinking that their presence in the BDSM community could be even more visible than in any other communities, just because it is a chance to really play with power roles and to use, restraint for power and pleasure. And I thought that playing with those norms could be extra beneficial to someone with a physical disability that is oftentimes assumed to not want sex or pleasure. See you in our concluding segment, in my concluding segment. Hi, so this is the end of week 4. This week I talked about prostitution and sex robots and separatism mostly. In this concluding segment, I'm going to go talk a little bit about the Pride Walk and my overall thoughts from the week. So first of all, I went to the Pride Walk, and it was a cool experience. I haven't been to a march or a parade, a Pride parade in a few years. One, because I'm not usually here, I'm usually in a different country or camp. But two, I haven't in Pittsburgh. I have one friend and she's not gay. So and I didn't feel like it was like I was supposed to go unless I was going with a person that was LGBT plus. And after our conversations this week on allies, I can't tell if that's the right choice or not. But I went on the walk, and it was very interesting because it wasn't a parade; it was a Pride walk, and yet you still had like spectators like looking and taking photos, and I mean you could tell they were mostly tourists. But I thought that was an interesting division of like you're still getting stared at and stuff. That wasn't very articulate. So my thought. Also, I found the walk to be a little underwhelming. It obviously isn't the main event of Pride in Amsterdam, but I didn't. It wasn't a political walk, and it wasn't as slap happy as like the last Pride event I went to was. So I'm interested to see what the rest of Pride events have in store. So I really want to keep talking about separatism, but I don't know how I feel about it still, so I'm gonna just reflect on the actual week itself. And I've noticed that, especially with the Frankirk, which like we've had a lot of speakers from, and like we've really been encouraged to go there. I think it is not. It's too radical for me, simply put. I can't be an anarchist and go into policy at the same time, and I do want to go into policy. So I don't feel like, and I do think that the government has a place in the world. And so I just don't agree with a lot of the things, I guess, with a lot of their philosophies. I really don't like all cops are bad. I think there really are some good cops, and I definitely like recognize the police brutality of these last few years. But to have violent imagery of bashing in cops' heads, that's crossing the line that I discussed from anger to hate. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's justified or right. So, and we've been taught, like we were invited to Annual Pride, and I understand that Pride is a capitalist event, but I'm a little frustrated that we've had all of these talks from the very radical Frankirk line of feminism and queer philosophy, queer community, but that we haven't had any representation from Pride, from a Pride organizer or anything like that. And I understand that may be hard to get, but I feel like we're getting a very radical side to feminism in queer politics that are not representative of the entire queer community here in Amsterdam. And I get that the point of showing the Frankirk is to show the ones that you don't see otherwise, but we're not seeing those people in the first place. So I was a little overwhelmed by the amount of philosophy this week that I was sort of pushing against. But I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about the origins of different oppressions from capitalism and government that I think has opened my eyes more. So I'm glad to have learned more. I just wish I had more sides of the story. I'll see you next week.